Ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening. My name is Sharan Sethi, and I'm your host on this long format interview. Joining me today for a conversation is somebody really special. I've been looking forward to his interviews. I've been watching some of his interviews where he's spoken about several issues ranging from international security to terrorism and radicalism and how it emanates in the Western societies. Joining me today is Phil Gurski. Phil, thank you so much for joining us. I hope everything's good in Canada.
Well, winter has just started, but I like winter, I like snow, I like cold, so I'm not complaining. But thank you very much for having me on the podcast. It's a real honor to be here with you.
It's a real honor for us to have you here. Just a little introduction about Phil. Phil is currently the president and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting and has previously served as a senior strategic analyst in the Canadian Security Intelligence Services. So obviously, you have seen uh, in detail as to what radicalism can do, how ideologies influence people and interact with each other. But let me start with the basics, right? We've all seen Bond movies and we all read spy novels. And each of our countries have their own intelligence agencies. The Americans have the CIA, we have the research and analysis wing. But for our audience who may not be as aware, can you tell us what the Canadian intelligence is like?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, you can see I'm not Daniel Craig. I'm not nearly as handsome as he is, and I don't carry a gun and I don't kill people. But Canadian intelligence is a fairly small community. So the organizations that I worked for, so the first one was actually called Communications Security Establishment, which is signals intelligence or SIGINT. Right. And I spent 17 and a half years there from the early 80s up until, well, just prior to 9/11, when I moved to the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, or CSIS, and that's where I became focusing on Islamist terrorism. Again, I started 9 months before 9/11. We were looking at all kinds of Canadians who had traveled to join Al-Qaeda. There are Canadians that fought in Bosnia, Canadians that fought with bin Laden, actually in Afghanistan. And then we started to see plots at home in the 2000s and the 2010s. The way that it works here in Canada, Sharan, intelligence is not evidence. And what that means is that the information that CSIS collects cannot be used in a Canadian court because it's not collected to the standard which the court requires.
Right.
But we can still share it with our law enforcement partners, most of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, whom I'm sure a lot of your listeners have heard of. It's a delicate dance, though, because you don't want the intelligence to taint the evidentiary stream because it can get you in trouble down the road when the judge rejects the information because it wasn't collected to the standard necessary. CSIS used to be part of the RCMP until 1984. It was called the Security Service back then. And as the consequence of a royal commission, and we in Canada have royal commissions for all kinds of things, most of which don't require royal commissions, the decision was made to create a purely civilian security intelligence service. So when the transition happened, a lot of RCMP officers resigned their police commissions, became civilians, and joined this new organization, which has been around now. It's going to celebrate its 38th birthday in July of 2022. About 3,000, 3,500 strong right across Canada. It is a domestic security intelligence service, but that does not mean it does not operate internationally because Canadians operate internationally. And we do have agreements with any variety of intelligence services, including Indian services, where we can exchange information that we collect to help keep each other safe.
And what are the most important desks that you have at the agency? Because in India, Pakistan and China are clearly the strategic competitors that we have. So those desks are very important for us. In Canada, what's the equivalent?
The CSIS mandate is defined in Section 2 of the CSIS Act, which dates from 1984. And there are four main investigative streams, if you will. There's foreign espionage, so foreign intelligence services trying to infiltrate Canada. And let's face it, we're talking about the Russians, we're talking about the Chinese, we're talking about the North Koreans, et cetera. Right. There's also what's called foreign interference, and that's slightly different. That means we're Canada, of course, is a nation of immigrants. I myself am third generation Eastern European immigrant to Canada. My grandfather immigrated here in the early 1900s. And we find that some countries try to exert influence on Canadian diasporas. Again, a prime example is China. The Communist government of China is constantly trying to infiltrate the Chinese Canadian community to try to influence its opinions, to try to get it to put pressure on the Canadian government not to criticize China, for example. The third part of the mandate is terrorism. And that's, for the last 20 years or so, that's been the primary focus of CSIS resources because of all the plots that we came across, and mostly to do with Islamist terrorism, although right-wing extremism has also risen in recent past. The fourth part is what's called subversion, and that's any effort to undermine the democratically elected government of Canada. Not something we talk a lot about. More important during the Cold War, I would say, where the Soviet Union was trying to undermine Canadian democracy. But those are the four main areas that involve CSIS. As I said, in the past 20 years, counterterrorism has been I think not the most important, but probably had the most resources. But we're finding now, of course, that we're having a lot more to do with counterespionage and counter foreign interference. I should also mention that CSIS does also cooperate with what's now our neighbor, Communications Security Establishment, where I used to work on signals intelligence. And CSE also is Canada's Cyber Command for trying to protect Canadian computer systems from outside penetration.
It's very interesting that you mentioned how security and immigration go hand in hand, and in a sense, have a lot of risks that also come with it. While Canada has been very welcoming, very diverse in terms of accepting a lot of immigrants who are in search for a home, but that naturally turns out to be a risk at some point too. And we've seen that with different communities coming into Canada. I think one of the interest angles for India, and this has been going on for a while, is the Khalistani movement, which is indirectly or directly supported by certain individuals and organizations in Canada. So just to, can you give us a little history about how this is perceived in Canada? Because obviously we have an Indian perception of what the problem is. But I would like to hear from you what you think about this.
Absolutely. And yes, it has become a sensitive issue for reasons that don't make sense to me, but I'll get to that in a minute. So essentially what we call Sikh terrorism, Sikh extremism, or the Khalistani movement, as you say, has been a problem for Canada for a very, very long time. I'd like to remind your listeners that the single greatest act of aviation terrorism in history, prior to 9/11, took place in Canada. It was the downing of the Air India flight off the coast of Ireland in July of 1985. That was a plot that was designed and implemented by Canadian Sikh terrorists out of British Columbia on the West Coast. A second plane that was going through Japan landed in Narita Airport, and 2 baggage handlers were killed by a bomb on board. That was a defining moment for Canada, where I think that we realized, or the government realized, because the security services had long realized this before, that there were Canadians, part of certain diasporas, who would use Canada as a staging base. And just to give you another example, prior to Air India, in 1982 and 1985, Armenian Canadians targeted Turkish diplomats, killing one and killing a security guard in attacks against a Turkish military attaché who was killed in his car and the Turkish embassy. And these were Armenian Canadians seeking to punish Turkey for the 1916 so-called genocide/massacre of Turkish Armenians during the First World War. So Canada is no stranger to diaspora politics, to diaspora tensions, and Sikh terrorism was the dominant investigation for the 1980s. I remember being part of it, even when I was at CSE.
Right.
The problem has become is that in recent years, there are a number of Sikh Canadians who don't like the term Sikh terrorism. They don't like the term Sikh extremism because they think it labels the Sikh community. And there's nothing further from the truth. Sikh terrorism is what it is. It is terrorism used by a small number of extremists who want to use violence to force the Indian government to grant Khalistani independence in the Punjab. Right. That is the definition of terrorism under the Canadian Criminal Code. And yet we've kind of reached a point, and I'll call it what it is, whether you call it woke culture or cancel culture or political correctness or whatever you want to call it, the government is being pressured and has caved in, and it no longer uses the term Sikh terrorism. I still use it because that's accurate. But the government is worried about votes. If you've got a large Sikh or Indian diaspora in your riding and you use the wrong words, they may not vote for you. So there's a lot of political correctness going on in Canada right now. Right. I don't remember the last time there was a serious Sikh extremist plot that came from Canada. But on the other hand, I also am not ignorant. There are probably still individuals who still hold to the creation of an independent Khalistan in the Punjab.
Right.
And some of them will actually resort to the use of violence, whether it's here in
Right.
Canada or abroad. And so I think we have to remain vigilant to this cause. It hasn't gone away.
Right.
I mean, the goal has not been achieved. The goal
Right.
is an independent Khalistan. And knowing what I know about the Modi government in your country, I'm guessing that's not going to happen anytime soon.
Right.
And for some
Thank you so much
people,
for that erudite answer. But this is one thing that we in India have always been asking. Now, considering that this is an ideological movement that wants a separate state of Khalistan, what the hypocrisy is here is that Khalistan, technically, according to the maps that these groups have drawn, need to also include certain parts of Pakistan, but they conveniently ignore that, and somehow the entire attention seems to be on India, and that sort of is a murky deal, right?
No, you're right. And this is the problem when you try to carve out independent states from other independent states. Another example would be Kurdistan. I mean,
Right.
you have Kurdish terrorist groups like the PKK, for example, that want to carve out an independent Kurdistan. The problem is that an independent Kurdistan would take a third of Turkey, a quarter of Iraq, a quarter of Syria, and even parts of northwestern Iran. And those four countries are not going to agree to just give up their territory for an independent Kurdistan. I think it's the same problem with Khalistan.
Right.
I'm not debating whether the Sikhs see themselves as an independent nation. That's entirely their regard.
Right.
But to translate your Sikhness, if I can use that word, into a political entity, into an integral political,
Right.
borders, is going to create problems not for one state but for two states, as you said, and that's not going to happen tomorrow. So I mean, so what might happen? So either they're satisfied with their autonomy in that part of India and Pakistan, or the minority who want to carve out an actual state by violence, and then you have to. I mean, who's going to recognize it?
The
Nobody
problem is
recognizes.
with the weaponization of these political movements, and
Yes.
that is a concern for not just national security but also bilateral relations.
Yes.
Say between India and Pakistan. But since you've been dealing with radical ideologies, you've been studying religious dogmas and how these ideologies interact with each other. Now, of course, there is Sikh extremism. There's the Islamists. How do you find the nuances? How do you distinguish, and how do you see these ideologies interact with each other?
Wow, that's a really good question. I think it depends. I think there certainly are opportunities where one movement sees an advantage in cooperating with another. The problem with the Islamists is the Islamists hate everybody. I mean, the Islamists don't just hate the West, they hate the Jews, they hate Buddhists, they hate Hindus, they hate Sikhs, right, because they see them as non-Muslim. In fact, they hate most Muslims. Right. People forget the vast majority of victims of Islamist terrorist attacks are other Muslims. Right. These are people that believe that their version of Islam is the only dominant one, the only real one, and therefore that's why they kill everybody. So I think that would make it difficult to see any kind of collaborative effort. The bottom line, though, is the way I like to express religious terrorism is very, very simple. There's three phrases to it. Something's wrong. I know what's wrong. I know who's responsible for it, and I have some kind of divine jurisdiction or some divine justification for changing it, often through the use of violence. And if you use that formula, you can describe Islam as extremism. So the West, Muslim countries have been oppressed. The West is at fault. God, Allah is telling me to kill them to get my way. Same thing with, Sikh terrorism. India won't grant us an independent Khalistan. We've tried for centuries. It is not working. Therefore, we're authorized to kill, including prime ministers, to kill prime ministers to get our way.
Right.
So I think there are some commonalities underlying religious extremism. I'd also say there's commonalities underlying other types of ideological and political extremism.
Fantastic. Obviously, I've been reading a lot of your books and writings. So I'm going to ask you a few questions based on that. And the most recent development has been in Afghanistan. Of course, the US finally made an exit from there, a rather embarrassing one, if I may add. You say that you're not very hopeful about peace in Afghanistan in our lifetime. So why do you say that?
The Taliban can now claim, somewhat dishonestly, that they've defeated the two greatest armies in the history of the planet. So the Soviet Union left in 1989 from Afghanistan after a decade-long occupation and didn't achieve anything. Now, mind you, that wasn't the Taliban weren't around back then. It was Al-Qaeda and its allies. The Taliban came about in the early 1990s. But
Right.
the Taliban can definitely say it was because of our attacks, relentless attacks on American forces, on Afghan security forces, that the Americans finally withdrew this past summer. That's their claim to fame. And as a consequence, because the Taliban, at least in Canada, is still a listed terrorist entity, we have legislation that says that. This is why
Right.
Canada cannot recognize the Taliban as the government, because it would recognize a listed terrorist group as an actual entity, which has actually, as a side note, huge implications for Canadian foreign aid. Can we send money to Afghanistan? Is that financial support for a terrorist group? Really problematic. And yet Afghans are starving with winter coming up.
Yeah.
The problem is that the Taliban have said that they've changed. They call it Taliban 2.0.
Yeah.
And that's complete crap. They haven't changed one little bit. I still follow Afghanistan on a daily basis. They're still closing schools for girls. Women can't go to work. They're still carrying out attacks against Hazara Shias because, according to the jihadis, the Shia are not Muslims and deserve to die. They're fighting Islamic State in Khorasan, fine, because they are rivals. Islamic State in Khorasan is mostly ex-Taliban who thought the Taliban wasn't brutal enough, wasn't violent enough. They created an Islamic State affiliate in the eastern part of the country. But Al-Qaeda is still there. I mean, everyone said Al-Qaeda disappeared. Al-Qaeda hasn't gone anywhere. They've been there for the past 25, 30, actually close to 30 years now, actually longer. And as a consequence, the Taliban may not actively say to Al-Qaeda, go ahead and attack the Americans or the Chinese or the West, but they're not going to kick them out. As a consequence, Afghanistan has now returned. Well, it never really stopped being so. Afghanistan remains a training ground for terrorism and terrorist groups. There's dozens of terrorist groups. Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan is in Afghanistan. East Turkestan Islamic Movement is in Afghanistan. And the list goes on and on. As a consequence, not only internal security is at risk, so is regional and international security, because those groups are being allowed to function by the Taliban.
Correct. And to what degree do you think Pakistan can hold together the Taliban in terms of their influence? Because in popular knowledge, it's said that there are 6 factions within the Taliban, out of which the Pakistanis may have an influence of 2 or 3, maybe. That too with with the help of the Haqqani network. But as soon as the Taliban was in power, you could see them go back to their old tricks of saying that, we are essentially Pashtun nationalists and we don't recognize the Durand line. So it's back to square one again.
You raise a very interesting question, Sharon, and I'll just put out, say, I'm not a Pakistani expert by any stretch of the imagination. The problem with when you lie down with terrorists is you're playing a very, very dangerous game. Pakistan obviously saw something in its national interest to do that for the better part of the last 20 or 30 years. But the Taliban, I don't think, really owe anything to Pakistan. They don't think they have to obey Pakistani leadership. And of course, Pakistan itself suffers from terrorist attacks on a regular basis. Up in the Northwest Frontier Province, there's a Balochi separatist movement in southwestern Pakistan that carries out regular attacks in Quetta and other parts of the country. I think they're playing a very dangerous game. And the reasons for it, well, part of it's rivalry with India. Part of it is, and you know that much better than I do. But I think that the Pakistanis really need to take a look in the mirror and say, is this really in Pakistani interests to be, cavorting with a terrorist organization like the Taliban, which could turn around tomorrow and carry out more attacks on Pakistani soil? It's never a good idea to put all your eggs in the terrorist basket. And I think Pakistan, I'm hoping they realize that, because it was a bad idea at the start. And I think it's a bad idea right now.
Right. And, Phil, during your service, career at the services, you may have interacted with a lot of people who need to be de-radicalized, who were earlier radicalized. So I'm genuinely curious as to what it takes to radicalize somebody so innocent. These are essentially civilians who probably consume content through different means and are radicalized using different, cunning methods by these extremist organizations. So can you share some of your experiences?
Sure. So just sorry to do this. This is my very, very first book from 2015, The Threat from Within. Right. I studied radicalization to violence for the better part of 15 years at the Security Service, looking at the cases we were investigating, looking for commonalities and differences. And we found that, there wasn't any prototype. There isn't any one special personality that becomes radicalized. What is consistent are the things they do and say once they become radicalized, especially from an Islamist perspective. There's certain books they read, there's certain websites they visit, there's certain things they say, et cetera, et cetera. So everybody gets there on their own individual way. The problem is that most people who become radicalized don't become violently radicalized. And that's a big difference. As somebody said the other day, it's not illegal to be a misogynist. It's illegal to become a violent misogynist if you take your misogyny and you start killing women because you don't like them. It's the same with Islamist extremism. There's all kinds of Islamist extremists that aren't violent in nature. And that's not against the law in Canada. I'm sure it's not against the law in India. Once you've committed to violence, though, that's when it becomes a problem. That's why the security services and law enforcement try to investigate you before you can kill people rather than afterwards. Right. The challenge then becomes if you've been arrested, you've been put on trial, you've been found guilty, you've been incarcerated, now what? And a lot of people talk about de-radicalization as if it's some kind of a reversal of the radicalization process. Yeah. I'm a skeptic for the simple reason that it's impossible to tell. Okay. And somebody may say, I no longer believe in the ideology. I was tricked. Right. I've realized it was the wrong thing to do. And I no longer am interested in that. But the problem is, how do you tell? I mean, people lie all the time. As I used to joke, if you go into any prison, whether it's in India or Canada, and you ask the inmates, how many of you are guilty? The answer is 0. Nobody's guilty. They're all tricked by the police or by the state. So how do you actually know that someone's become de-radicalized? There's also a distinction between de-radicalization and disengagement. And what that means is somebody who is disengaged may hold to the exact same ideology as they did before. They've just chosen to no longer act violently in the name of that ideology. So disengagement is better than nothing. But if you disengage but still hold to the radical ideology, there's a chance you can re-engage at some point and become a terrorist. It's a very complicated area. A lot of people make claims that I don't think are justified based on the data that I've seen, but it seems to be something that we can de-radicalize a whole population, and I don't think we can.
Right. Phil, to a certain degree, if Muslims were to pick up weapons because they're being shown, the American bombings in one region of the world, it's an emotional issue. And also because of several, policies that countries have followed, civilians have lost a lot of lives, and let's admit it. Yeah. So to a certain degree, you can only understand why somebody might pick up a weapon, although it's not at all justified, obviously. But what surprises me even more, and you've written extensively on this, is how Western people who are not necessarily Muslims have also joined the jihadis. How does this happen?
Well, you raise a very good point. A drone strike that takes out a family that has nothing to do with Lashkar-e-Toiba or Hizb ut-Tahrir al-Shams or Al-Qaeda or ISIS creates a whole system of martyrdom. Right. And people want revenge. That's a basic human, I don't know, I wouldn't call it a need, but it's a basic human reaction. If you hurt my family, I want to hurt your family in return. And I think that this is what the jihadis have very successfully done. I will give them credit. Their propaganda and their online media, their platforms have been extremely successful in painting this picture. Drones and airstrikes and U.S. special forces and armies have come to occupy Muslim lands. They're killing Muslims. They're raping Afghan women or Muslim women. And what are you going to do about it? And they almost they make you feel personally responsible for a reaction. How can you sit there in Canada or in India while your sisters and brothers are suffering in Iraq or Afghanistan or Somalia or Nigeria, whatever? And as a consequence, people that have nothing to do with the area, and I saw it for well over a decade, a Canadian from a small town somewhere in Western Canada, next thing you know, he's fighting in Somalia. And I think, well, what are you doing in Somalia? You're not even Somali. But because they're convinced that Somali Muslims are suffering, that the West is at fault, and they want to do their part to protect them. Part of it too is that they're sold this notion that if you're a martyr, then you get rewards. There's the so-called paradise that awaits you if you die a martyr. Right. It's a very strong message, and I understand why it works. And you know what? It's no different than the types of messages that we used here in Canada during the First and Second World Wars to recruit Canadians to go fight in Europe. Nazi German Nazis are killing innocent people in France. You have to go and help your French citizens. That's exactly, the propaganda was very similar actually for the First World War. And I read a book on that. It's fascinating. It's almost like a jihad in the First World War. And so when you have this emotional messaging and you feel a personal link, a personal relationship with people halfway around the world, that's why you get on a plane and that's why you go join these terrorist groups.
Very interesting. Once these individuals do return to the country of origin, let me connect this with to the previous answer that you gave. Because we genuinely do not know how much sincerely they've been de-radicalized, right? It's
Yeah.
impossible for
Yeah.
us to actually figure that out.
Yeah.
So in terms of their return, supposing they do return and supposing they do go through certain protocols that entail de-radicalization methods, there are still obvious security threats to the state. So how does intelligence actually filter this out, and how do you deal with this?
Great question. It requires resources. So if you were to return, and I've met people who've come back from fighting with terrorist groups abroad, and
Right.
it frightens me how committed I think that they still are. Well, your security services have to investigate them. They have to put them under surveillance to see where do they go, with whom do they meet, what is their online presence, and all of
Right.
that takes time and money. You have to actually have the people in place to follow people around physically. You have to have the people in place to monitor their telephone calls. If you get an intercept warrant from a court, you have to have the
Right.
people that can recruit human sources to try to find out what they're really thinking. And you only have
Right.
limited resources. And you've got other investigations simultaneously. So it's a huge challenge for security intelligence and law enforcement to simply have enough people to do all the cases at the same time. And as a consequence, you make decisions. You say,
Right.
okay, Sharon is he's okay. I'm not worried about him, but that Phil guy, wow, he's really still very much involved in the movement. I'm going to focus on him. What if
Right.
your decision is wrong? And what if we stop looking at you because we've assessed that you've been de-radicalized or disengaged, whatever, and a month from now or 2 months from now, you do something. I'll give you a very concrete case very shortly. Our biggest counterterrorism investigation was called the Toronto 18 back in 2005, 2006. 18 people eventually got arrested. One was convicted. He did his jail time. He got out of jail. He told everybody, you know what? I've changed. I'm a different man right now. You don't have to worry about me. Well, a year after getting out of jail, he was enrolled in a college program. He disappeared suddenly. Turns out he stole his cousin's passport. He altered his physical appearance to match the photo. He flew to Somalia and he died fighting for Al-Shabaab. He had convinced everybody that he no longer believed in this kind of movement, and here he was. He ended up dying with Al-Shabaab. So that to me is the lesson to be learned. You never know if somebody is going to re-engage, and that
Psychologically
requires
speaking,
resources.
do you think this is also possible because many of these recruits who have returned home also know that they won't be accepted by the common
Yeah.
society?
That's a really good point. I think there's a sense of rejection. There's a
Right.
sense of, well, you don't represent us anymore. In fact, you give us a bad name. So we're going to sort of push you away, not deal with you. And
Right.
as a consequence, if if your family rejects you or your friends or your community, well, who do you have left? Well, the same people you fought with in Somalia, Nigeria, Afghanistan, or Iraq. Those are your friends. Those are your family now. And as a consequence, you kind of go back to them. So but how do you accept somebody who fought for Al Qaeda? How do you accept somebody who fought for ISIS and kept a Yazidi sex slave? I mean,
Right.
that's pretty. I mean, I'm a father and a grandfather, and I think if one of my kids joined Al Qaeda, well, first of all, it'd be very embarrassing for that CSIS guy to have his son join Al Qaeda. But I mean, how would I feel personally about that?
Right.
That wouldn't be an easy thing to do, I think.
Since we're talking about how propaganda is disseminated using the internet, and it's becoming a huge issue. Obviously, it's not easy to police the internet, and also it, to a certain degree, it does curb freedom of speech and free expression and
Yeah,
privacy and whatnot. You know the entire debates that are going on in
yeah,
the United
yeah,
States, Canada, and India.
yeah.
I'll give you a recent example in India. So, in the eastern part of India, recently, violence was enabled by Islamists using fake news and misinformation.
Mhm.
This was also as seen as a reaction to the persecution of Hindu minorities in Bangladesh. So it has a big history to
Right.
it.
Yeah.
And the violence there in the easternmost part of India was coordinated by a group in the westernmost part of India, which has no connection whatsoever. So, in that sense, obviously, internet and digital platforms do play a very big role. So, while keeping uh, privacy in mind, while
Yeah.
keeping a lot of these fundamentals in mind, how does the intelligence deal with such threats online?
Not very well.
Right.
And it's a volume question. As you said, I mean, there's tens, hundreds of millions of websites out there. And, Facebook has promised to do a better job at taking down violent material. Twitter has promised to do a better job. But,
Right.
I don't know if you have this metaphor in India, but it's like playing whack-a-mole. Every time you shut down one site, 10 more sites come up.
Correct.
And it's an impossible task to monitor them all simultaneously. And there are times where it is very difficult to distinguish between freedom of speech, which our countries respect under our constitutions, and what constitutes exhortation to violence.
Right.
There's no easy answer to that question. And from an intelligence perspective, you can't monitor them all. So there are artificial intelligence, there's bots you can go to find this stuff, but you're constantly trying to play catch up with this thing. And these are hard decisions to make, but you're absolutely right. A lot of this stuff is being spread online. But here, if there's a silver lining to this crowd, Sharon, I want to give it. The vast majority of people who consume violent or extremist material online never do anything in the real world. They're happy to read it, they're happy to share it, they're happy to repost it, but most of them are the cowards or they're incompetent, or they don't really believe in the cause. Just because you share something doesn't mean you're going to strap on a suicide vest tomorrow. The challenge from the security intelligence and law enforcement perspectives is to identify the very, very small number who believe in the cause, share the information, and are willing to do something about it in the real world. And that's not an easy task either.
Makes sense. And since you've been also studying, the convergences and divergences as to how the Western intelligence agencies behave and function, and the Asian intelligence agencies do, what differences do you see in the way in which we practice our own policies?
Well, each country has its own legislations. Each country has its own particular ways of doing things. Not surprisingly, as a Canadian, you've probably heard the term the Five Eyes, which is the Anglo club. It's been around since the Second World War. So that's Australia, Canada, New Zealand, United Kingdom, United States. It is the gold standard of intelligence sharing. It's not surprising. We're all former British colonies at one point in our history. We were all English speaking. We all are Western secular liberal democracies, although under Trump, we were slightly less liberal, I suppose. And that's going on for 75 years. So it's a very, very well-established relationship. I found when I joined the security service that we also had a very easy relationship with other, I would call them like-minded services. So I'm talking Western Europe, the Swedish service, the Germans, the French, the Danish, et cetera, et cetera. We also collaborated with Middle Eastern and Asian services. I have had meetings with Indian services. I've had meetings with Middle Eastern services. They're a little more complicated to manage for the simple reason that we have different cultures. I think with India, for example, we have a common language. I mean, English is still spoken widely, obviously, in your country. You were a former British colony, as we're here in Canada. Culture is slightly different, but I think there was still a commonality there that we didn't have, for example, with the Saudis or with the Thais, or God forbid, but I even used to meet with the Russians before Putin took over. It's a delicate dance that you do, because you realize there's information that is of value to both organizations, but at the same time, your government may not want to deal with country X because of country X's foreign policy or domestic policy. So it's hard. I think you do it on a case-by-case basis. We in Canada have what's called a Section 17 arrangement, where CSIS can enter into sharing with any intelligence service around the world, provided that the foreign minister and the public safety minister agree to it. But it has to be managed on a case-by-case basis. And it generally works, but it is a challenge, I would say.
Right. Let me break away from the serious discussions for a minute and ask you a question about pop culture. Now, obviously, whether you look at Sherlock Holmes or James Bond, you look at the importance of utilizing human spies for intelligence. But in a world that is growing extremely digital and where people are interconnected over the internet, what is the relevance of human spies today?
What a great question.
I don't mean that in a condescending way, but in a genuine way.
No, it's a very good question. And it resonates with me, because the first 17 and a half years that I worked in intelligence, it was all signals. It was all intercept. This is before the internet, but still, it was all, satellite communications. We would intercept them. We would process them. We would decrypt them if we could, and we would gain the intelligence. Then I moved to the security service, and it was very much a human intelligence or human world. You know what, Sharon? I think it's all of the above. And there was one criticism that was made about the United States in particular, that leading up to 9/11, the Americans had abandoned, and that's not it's not entirely accurate, but it's somewhat accurate. Americans had abandoned human intelligence. and relied on signals intelligence only. Had they had a human source into the cells in the United States who had penetrated those 4 cells, they could have stopped 9/11 from happening. And I think they realized that. I think that came out of the 9/11 report as well. The bottom line is that when you're in intelligence, you want it all. You want signals, you want human intelligence, you want surveillance, you want imagery, if it's satellites or drones. You want as big a picture as possible to cover all the possibilities to determine the nature of the threat. I think when we rely on any given source over another, that's when we run into problems. Now, in some cases, it's really hard to recruit a human source. Like if it's a one-person cell, how do you infiltrate a source? It's impossible. Sometimes signals are really hard to collect because of the way in which they're being sent, encryption, et cetera. But I think the bottom line for most intelligence agencies is that you want to have as widely distributed a collection program that includes all the possible intelligences to get the best picture you can.
Right. Very interesting. And do you think that with the United States pulling out of Afghanistan, somewhat the war on terrorism has been unofficially declared to end?
Well, it never should have been called a war on terrorism in the first place. That was the wrong term. There's a quote I use a lot, and I love this quote. I got it just after 9/11 from an American who was working in Paris. He said, "It's usually a bad idea to declare a war against a common noun."
Right.
So we have war on drugs, we have war on poverty. Drugs isn't going to surrender. Poverty is not going to surrender. It's not like declaring war on Fiji. Right. Fiji can surrender and the war can be over. Terrorism is not going to surrender. There's no terrorist a terrorist group may decide to stop operating, and that happens, but terrorism is not going to surrender. So the whole consequence is that the war was ill-named. Secondly, and this is equally as problematic, when you talk about a war, who do you think are the primary players in the war? Well, armies, navies, air forces, soldiers. That's what soldiers do. And terrorism was always best seen as something that security, intelligence, and law enforcement agencies should deal with. And we're not soldiers, at least not in the purest sense of the word. Is the war over? Well, it predates 9/11. I mean, terrorism has been around in a modern sense since the middle of the 19th century. It's not going away. Islamist terrorism is still happening on a daily basis, as I find when I tweet out every day. The far right is becoming more and more worrisome. The far left is also rising in terms of eco-terrorism. We have, the so-called single issue things that we have as well. So the war may be declared over because we withdrew from Afghanistan, but the struggle or the challenge of terrorism, which is a better word than a war, is going to go on indefinitely.
Right. One would naturally expect that, with the world being more literate day by day, with the human indices performing very well around the world, you would probably see a decline of, religious dogmas being utilized as weapons of war, but it doesn't seem to end. So, in a far more progressive world, in a futuristic sense of speaking, do you think religious radicalism will decline, or this is going to be a perpetual problem that we'll have to deal with?
I'm a big Star Trek fan. I always have been, ever since the first Star Trek series came out, well before you were born in the 1960s. And in the world of Star Trek, which is the 24th century, war has ended, as has poverty. Humans have solved poverty. So I'm cautiously optimistic. The problem is that whether the terrorism is religiously inspired or some other ideology, humans always have ideologies. I mean, religion is not going to die. I mean, we may be less religious, generally speaking, than we were, let's say, a century ago. I mean, Canada is largely a secular nation. Other countries are still highly religious. Most Middle Eastern states, for example, are still highly religious. Religious people run the show. Look at Saudi Arabia. It's still run by the clerics. Right. It's a hard question to answer. And I think that even if religion as a primary motivator declines, other ideological frameworks will jump into the gap, meaning there will always be somebody willing to kill, willing to use violence in the name of a cause. That cause doesn't have to be religious. The legislation in Canada that describes terrorism says it's an act of serious violence that is carried out for political, ideological, or religious reasons. That's a very, very wide scope. I mean, what is ideological? Some would argue that a lot of the global warming activists are ideologically motivated. And what happens when they start using violence? We have an example here just last week where a very famous Canadian scientist named David Suzuki said that we're going to have to start blowing up pipelines to make our point. Well, that's an act of terrorism under Canadian law. Yeah. And he was criticized for that. So bottom line, Sharon, is that if religion declines, something else will take its place.
Right. And, during your career, you have also seen the Al-Qaeda rise and recruit, people out of Canada as well, for that matter. So can you tell our Indian audience more about how Al-Qaeda, made its way into Canada for that matter, way back? This is like 2.5 decades back. How did they manage to radicalize someone at least? And at that point of time, you did not have the internet or any other source for, easier forms of radicalization or easier mediums to radicalize them.
One thing we find when it comes to this radicalization to violence phenomenon, and radicalization, as you say, it's a problematic term. It often just depends on a few people. So we had an individual in Canada in the 1990s who adopted the ideology, and he was very charismatic, and he had a whole bunch of people that he had convinced in meeting them personally or calling them on the telephone or sending them emails. And often it just takes one person to be able to convince a whole bunch of other people to do things. Your listeners may be familiar with a man called Anwar al-Awlaki, who was an American Yemeni. He convinced tens of thousands of people to join Al-Qaeda because of his charismatic personality. And we used to come across him as well in our investigations. Sometimes it's helped. We had a Canadian family that lived with bin Laden in Afghanistan in the 1990s. Well, the whole family was radicalized to the Al-Qaeda ideology. Some of them came home to Canada. They could use their experiences to convince others. The analogy that we used to use is that people who had already adopted the ideology were like flowers, and the people around them were like bees. So, bees fly around a flower, they land for a little bit, they take some nectar, then they fly away. That's exactly what it was. These flowers would be out there, they would make themselves known, and then the bees would just visit them and take little bits and pieces away, and they would then become radicalized themselves. So yeah, the internet facilitates things, but it certainly isn't the only way to radicalize people. You can have actually physical networks of people that you use to do that.
In terms of threat perceptions, what do you think is up ahead for Canada?
Wait, let me get my crystal ball. I keep it in my back pocket. Well, as I've been saying to people for years now, and I hope people are listening, Islamist extremism has not gone away. We haven't had an attack in Canada since 2018, but we still have Canadians who believe in this ideology. We've had a number of right-wing attacks, most famously, or rather infamously, an attack on a mosque in 2017, in which 6 people were killed. I worry about far left. I worry about eco-activism that turns into eco-terrorism. So what that means is that your security services, which have been focusing almost exclusively on Islamist terrorism for the past 2 decades, since 9/11, are now being asked to look at a multiplicity of threats simultaneously. And as I said before, that takes resources. I don't think Sikh terrorism has gone away. I really don't, because an independent Khalistan has not been declared. And you will always find people that say, until we get an independent Khalistan, we will not eliminate the option of using violence to achieve our goals. Right. I think that Turkey hasn't apologized for the Armenian genocide of 1916. Yeah. Are there some Armenians who still want to teach the Turks a lesson? Probably. And that requires your security services to investigate them all simultaneously. Sharon, my most recent book that I wrote, The Peaceable Kingdom, it's a history of terrorism in Canada from our creation as an independent nation in 1867 to the present. We've only seen at most maybe 20 attacks in 150 years. So that's like an attack every 7 years. Right. I don't think Canada's going to become like Afghanistan tomorrow, where there's an attack a day, or Somalia or Nigeria. We'll still be a relatively safe country. Most people don't subscribe to these violent ideologies in Canada. A small number do, but it'll be incumbent on our security services and law enforcement to be vigilant, to keep an eye on these people, because at any given time, anyone can decide today's the day I want to do something. Well,
I really hope it doesn't become like Afghanistan, and I know that it won't.
No, I don't think so.
Very nice people, and I hope all of you stay safe and healthy.
Thank you.
But let me ask you my last question, and we'll conclude with that. Since you were talking about eco-terrorism, that's actually an interesting phenomenon because it's not so popular in India or Asia for that matter. But it's understandably so in the Western countries, especially the US and Canada. Do you think, it will be introduced to the mainstream and it will become a huge security nightmare in the future? Or is that a bit of a stretch?
Potentially. It depends on how much the frustration grows. So we just had the COP26 in Glasgow. There are people that, government, your government made commitments, my government made commitments to make changes to fossil fuel use, to cleaning up this, cleaning up that.
Right.
If enough people remain convinced this is all just hot air, no pun intended for global warming, and that governments aren't serious about doing something, there will always be the fringe of a fringe of a fringe who are convinced the only way to send a message is to start blowing things up.
Right.
If that's the case, I think it's inevitable that we will see eco-terrorism on the rise. Whether or not it involves just infrastructure damage, like blowing up oil pipelines, or in your country, shutting down coal factories, for example, or coal mining, I don't know. But I certainly wouldn't eliminate it as highly possible. I won't say it's highly probable, but if the evidence of global climate change worsens over the next 5 to 10 years, and the perception is that nothing serious is being done to stop it, I think it's inevitable that fringe of the fringe of the fringe will take matters in their own hands and act violently because they're convinced that nobody's listening, and it's becoming too late to act. And when people become desperate and they think the world is going down a pathway of no return, then they resort to desperate actions. And those desperate actions could in fact include violence. So it's not a prediction per se. It's a feeling that it's almost inevitable that it's going to happen down the road.
Sure. Phil, it was an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. It was my pleasure as well. I loved your questions. You made me think a lot for a Thursday gray morning here outside of Ottawa. And I just want to thank you for bringing me on the podcast. It was a real honor.
Thank you so much. It was a real honor too. And I hope I've not thrown you off guard with a few of my questions. The James Bond part was never in my questionnaire.
You know what? It's we used to joke in intelligence that, you asked me a question and I could tell you the answer, but then I have to kill you. But we used to get these jokes all the time about James Bond. And well, I mean, look at me. Do I look anything like Daniel Craig or Roger Moore or Sean Connery? The answer, well, maybe Sean Connery these days. But no, it's we get this all the time. But if I can just leave you with one thing for your audience, those considering a career in security intelligence or law enforcement, I highly recommend you give it serious thought. It's an amazing career. I had a job with no word of exaggeration. I couldn't wait to get to work every morning because it was so exciting and different. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity I have. And this is why I advise young Canadians on careers in security intelligence and law enforcement. So it's a great job. You're helping to protect your country. And it's really cool. You're doing really cool stuff. Not quite James Bond, but then again, I don't want to kill anybody anyway. So
yeah, I mean, maybe a word of precaution would also be to advise them to join their own country's intelligence.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've worked with the IB, I've worked with RAW in the past, and they've got you have a lot of challenges in your country. And I think that, having the best people in place in the security intelligence law enforcement agencies is the way to go.
Right. Well, I really hope you can join us for a conversation soon.
I'd be more than happy to go with a part 2, Saran. No problem.
Thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
Namaste. We hope you enjoyed this Citti Media content. Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.